the cyber regulations and what it requires from firms in terms of their disclosures and their filings that way. So I think it's interesting to kind of look at this from a broader perspective first as we back into this and understand why the SEC cares about this. Undoubtedly, there is, as in any organization, some power struggles between different agencies of the U.S. government. But this one, I think, is a very clear, bright line between the role of the SEC and how cybersecurity affects all these things. And hopefully you can see this too. The role of the SEC is obviously to ensure that the markets are fair and that they're orderly, efficient, and to protect investors from scams and things like that. So they take a lot of actions in regard to those types of things. They also want to make sure that there is sufficient capital formation in the markets to maintain the health of the U.S. economy. I think you can draw a straight line from this fair, orderly, efficient piece of it to things like the disclosure rule, especially as we become much more entangled in our requirements and use of cybersecurity and technology broadly to deliver on firms' value propositions. I think if you look at it critically, you can understand that the SEC thought there was a need for this rule because there is a lack of transparency around the exposure that cybersecurity risk has to these securities and commodities. And if you go even further, you can probably say that they think that the price of firms, so that firms are overpriced as a result of the lack of this transparency. That last piece may be a stretch, but I think it's interesting to see that they want to ensure that there's a greater disclosure amongst these types of things. And this is important because in any organization, and I think this is especially true post-COVID, that we have a much stronger reliance on technology broadly to deliver on the products and services that firms deliver. This was, at the time, we used to use a term called digital transformation. I think that term is still used to a much lesser extent than it was even just a few years ago. But it is broadly speaking, an enterprise-wide kind of thing that we have to worry about. In much larger firms, they sort of think about risk as an enterprise function, and even in mid-sized, so smaller firms, it's important, at least implicitly, I think we all understand the role that technology plays in the deliverance of these types of stuff. Usually, you sort of see cyber in a silo as a separate type of risk, but it can clearly be the type of thing that facilitates or triggers the realization of risk in any vertical. Certainly didn't plan this, obviously, but it is helpful sometimes to have these types of webinars after a large, wide-scale event like we saw with the CrowdStrike Microsoft issue, to really sort of underscore some of the importance of these things and how they can trigger problems in the business cases and the delivery of those products and services in our organization. So sometimes this is managed in what's called GRC, governance, risk, and compliance, and it's important as part of these things to better understand what's the impact of these risks, what's the likelihood, how bad could it be, if it got really bad, how could our firm handle that? And I have a slide that talks about that later. But also, again, post CrowdStrike now, we can begin to sort of think about it's not just first party risk, it's also our third parties and our fourth parties and the folks that they all rely on to be able to deliver these types of things. We have to care a lot about materiality, and I think you're probably here because of materiality concerns. I think there is a clear parallel between understanding materiality of cybersecurity risk and understanding risk appetite. And if you solve for one, you solve for both of them. And I'll give you some examples of how to do that. So you have to better understand, where you get data to support these types of things. This is something that our firm does, but also data on near misses and how can I leverage these to be able to, gather this data and put these things together for organizations. I'm going to pause right here for a second because there is a issue with these slides. Make sure I get these correct here for everybody. Those concerns about data gathering in cybersecurity are important and something that sometimes keeps firms from really doing a much better job understanding and putting together their concerns around materiality. But these are all things that can be solved for, especially when you get a better sense of what the requirements are for putting those types of disclosures in place. All right. So let's talk a little bit about what the rule actually says and what the requirements are. So we're coming up on a year now on this, and I think it's kind of timely to put this seminar on now to really understand how to come to terms with the requirements that these things have. So we have these needs of investors and other capital market participants being solved for by this requirement. There is an existing framework that talks about materiality disclosures. I want to jump off of that in a second here. And I think the SEC, most regulators and legal facilities tend to trail the pace of technology. Now I think they're really sort of understanding the role of that. And I think this really comes down to a number of ransomware events in particular that precipitated this disclosure rule. Really kind of important to understand what the role is for these things and how do you connect to them that way. I think it's important here basically to talk about the previous guidance on disclosure because the Chevron deference filing that happened, there's a lot of speculation around how this is going to affect the SEC disclosure rule. I'll give you, my perspective on this. Because the SEC already has authority to compel disclosure of material events, I suspect that the majority of the SEC requirements are going to stay intact. I think they'll be challenged, and then we'll see what happens from there, and maybe some nips and tucks around the edges. But because there's already an existing framework and they just kind of expanded it to something else, even though it may not be named explicitly, I think it's kind of safe in terms of, we're already talking about material events broadly. Now we're just including another category versus creating a net new thing that didn't exist before. We'll see if I'm correct in that, but I think it's likely here to stay for some time. So the SEC recognizes the enterprise-wide nature of cybersecurity, as well as the need to think about these pervasive risks that exist across industries and how that can cascade into other types of risk, namely the types of risks that investors, both individual and investor, would care about. So generally, everybody needs to comply with this if you are a registered entity with the SEC. This includes, domestically traded companies and foreign private issuers. The disclosure deadlines have long since passed. So not just for large companies, which was at the end of last year, but now also for companies under the $250 million market cap. So we're in the position now where all these things are happening, and any annual disclosures that have happened after the end of last year have to include these sort of categories as well. This is a deep dive into this, and I won't read all this, but I'll sort of highlight some important stuff here. The first is any Reg SK disclosure, so these are your 10Ks, are really going to require you to talk about two particular things that I think are critical, and I think have been missed a little bit in some of the popular press reporting on this. So you have to talk about what your process for, and then they have a big list of adjectives here, verbs. What is your assessment, identification, management of material risk? That's an important part of this. So how are you managing cybersecurity in your firm, and which items there are you managing that are reasonably likely to affect business strategy, results of operation, or financial condition? For me, RU, or results of operation, I think is a critical one there. Because of our focus on cyber risk quantification, we spent a lot of time looking at the financial and economic impact of cybersecurity. So when I read that they want to know which cyber risk are affecting your results of operations or your revenue, I think that's an important component of this. So we'll see how that CRQ element can be helped can be leveraged to help facilitate a disclosure regime like this. They also want you to talk about governance. What is the board's role in looking over cybersecurity, and how are they assessing and managing material risk? So effectively, are you using that process above to develop materials that you are then reporting to the board, and are they taking action on it? Those are the things that they want to know. So you'll see the process for this is really, really very, very important. Most of what you have read about the SEC disclosure rule is really focused on this 8K item 105 that really is around incident disclosure. Now, it's important because I think the SEC draws this distinction that it's not just any incident, it's material incidents. What you've seen in the recent press has been a lot of what I've and others have called a non-material materiality disclosure. In other words, we're making a disclosure in order to prevent any sort of regulatory action, but we haven't taken the time to determine whether or not it's going to be material. We haven't made any statements in most of these disclosures about what those material things are. So sometimes what you see is subsequent micro disclosures. We had an event, and then 2 weeks later, you'll find more information about this event come out, and then we'll start putting more data about it. This is I wouldn't say drawn the ire of the SEC, but certainly the SEC has noticed this because they have released a letter recently talking about how it's important, and they somewhat ironically say that it is they reemphasize the fact that it's for material incident disclosure, not just for incident disclosure, which is probably about as much humor as you ever get out of the SEC. So when you look at that, it's really important to understand that they want you to take a look at the types of events that are happening, and if you're putting something in that line item, they want it to be material. Now, we'll talk a little bit about how they define material, but it is sort of a artifact of that process that you've established in the other 2 items there. The bottom 2 ones are less common, but still important for foreign private issuers, and it's the same kind of thing you see in the top 2. What's the board's oversight? What's management's role? What's the process for disclosure? And how do you disclose those types of things to your shareholders that way? You can click through and read those things too, but they're straight off the SEC website. So this process piece is what really, I think, will allow you to build a defensible argument if the SEC comes knocking and says that you're delinquent in something that you do. This requires governance and maturity, but you have to spend time looking for and understanding what these things are. So let's get into it. You have to build an alerting process around cyber issues. So how are you made aware of these things, and then what do you do with them? And then at what point are you escalating those into this material determination process? Who gets to make that determination? And then what's the criteria for doing it? I think building this framework for communication and determination is really, really very, very critical. It can be just as simple as understanding high-level scenarios in your organization, such as data loss and theft, business interruption, et cetera. Those are sort of common categories of cyber risk that way. And looking at the incident and saying, this is the type of thing that can precipitate us having a loss in this category. We've already predetermined that this category of loss, our risk management disclosures in our annual filings, have a 5% chance of exceeding our materiality threshold, therefore making a disclosure now. That's probably, you're not seeing this in these disclosure requirements, but I think they're a very mature way of doing that. So no evidence of anybody taking that approach to it yet, but I think that's ultimately where the SEC is going to want people to go. Today, what we're seeing is sort of a more broad, we've had an incident, we think it might be material kind of stuff, but not necessarily any tie back to those annual reports and those types of things. I think you'll see that develop over time that way. But this is a defensible process to do this, not just for first party, but again, for your third party risk. What are the things that we think could be triggered here in our third parties? What are our most critical third party suppliers? And an event on or involving these sorts of third parties are going to cause us to have these type of issues. And obviously, running a run through of this, having an exercise of this with the board would also just really put a cherry on top of this process in terms of its maturity and thoroughness. All right, so how do we determine what materiality is? Well, I'm going to skip to this slide here. The trick here is that the SEC hasn't really given you any real clarity around what that's supposed to be. They have relied on the same standard that applies under federal security laws for a very, very long time. What I sort of say in shorthand is the reasonable shareholder and total mix standards. So what that means is that you have to determine if a reasonable shareholder would care about this, or it significantly alters the total mix of information available. This is kind of difficult, and it's somewhat qualitative on purpose, but there are ways to address this. They specifically call out that they are not specifying a financial threshold, which I think many in the industry have interpreted mistakenly to mean that you should not set a threshold. But if you a careful reading of this will say that they are not saying there's a threshold, but that you should do one. This is an important part of some research I did around this, and I'll talk about in a second. But the important part is that you establish a process that identifies both those financial impacts as well as any of the non-financial impacts that way. The rule definitely does not say that you need somebody's products to do these types of things. It doesn't mention any standards, does not mention anything about benchmarking. So it's not a measure of are we at or above or below our peer cohorts in regards to our ability to do this. I think institutional investors especially will care a lot about that as part of that total mix piece, but it's not a requirement. So you have to think about this both quantitatively and qualitatively. I think, as I've mentioned a couple times already, that the CRQ aspect of this, I think, is a foundational element to really go through a lot of this. So I'll talk a little bit about coming up with these values here. And this is a paper that myself and a colleague wrote. This was last year when this came out. We looked at a couple different scenarios to better understand what these thresholds look like. Here's some assumptions that we went into doing this. We leveraged a large data set that looks at cyber incidents. It's called Advisen. We leverage it here at Kovrr with our products. And we're kind of looking at this saying, well, some of these things have to be material. So if we look at the top 50 incidents, we have to find some sort of threshold that allows us to say that this particular incident is actually material that way. So the assumption that I made was if we look at the top 50, we should find some sort of financial threshold that's a floor for thinking about what that looks like. And if those top 50 ones, in terms of the biggest ones that you could think of, were not material, then we need to go back and take another look at what those thresholds look like. So there's sort of an iterative process this way. And we'll look at a couple different slides where we ran this analysis. I think you have to also think about the way that these processes with a threshold sort of feed other kinds of things as well. And I'll get into that in a second for building this process. My slides got out of order. So, the first thing we did was take a look at this value at 4% of revenue. So what we're trying to find, again, is, what's this reasonable threshold for doing this type of stuff? This slide here talks a little bit about this. So when we're looking at and sort of figuring out what these thresholds should be, we went to the literature and said, hey, what are other people using as these thresholds? So again, the rule doesn't say you should set a threshold, but in practice, every auditing and accounting firm, every Big Four firm you can think of, has some sort of rule of thumb about this. And we found some references in the AICPA, the accounting journals, both in the US, Australia in particular, had some interesting resources there. So it's something that's sort of international. People sort of generally use a threshold to start with. And it could be any one of these variety of ones we found in the literature here, anyone from, views of gross profit, percentage thresholds, assets, revenue, et cetera. So we tested a bunch of these to see what we think the right one is. That's why we started with revenue here. We kind of looked at, what are the top things that we should care about? And then, what does that threshold look like? So we sort of mapped, and you can see the names of the events here that were in the Advisen data set and the years that they occurred. We adjusted for inflation that way, and said, would these have been material under, in this case, a 4% threshold, leveraging their revenue? So this call those reference values and then benchmark this way. So you can see only a handful of these top 50 would have been material using 4% of revenue. Jump down here. We went, plus or minus 100% of net income. Only 10% would be. 5% of equity also gave us around 10 of these values. So you sort of see it's sort of implications of this are that the general thresholds that are used in standard accounting methods for materiality are probably too high for cybersecurity. This means two things. One of which is important, and one of which is a little bit depressing. The first is cyber incidents generally don't register as impactful on a firm's profitability as other types of risk. This might be an artifact of history. As we become more dependent upon technologies, I think this is going to change generally. But also, it's a good thing. So, it's nice to know that even with the strong impact these things have on our operations, we can still maintain profitability that way. So good news, bad news there. I think the requirement is that something has to be material, so you have to sort of establish a threshold to do this. So we did a couple more experiments, and what we did was we found that right around 0.01%, which in finance parlance is called 1 basis point, was really where the threshold really starts to hit. In this case, 48 of those 50. The reference value is revenue. So looking at revenue, looking at 1 basis point of revenue really is a good starting point for thinking about your own materiality threshold. I'm not prescriptive in saying that everyone's needs to be there, but it's a place to begin thinking about it. I'll give you an example of what that looks like here in a second. Now, it's true that the guidance, as I showed earlier, says that you can't just say that it's not financial material, so you can just work from there. You also have to think about other things. However, I think it's important to think about the argument that if you've predetermined something to be financially material, in this case preliminarily so, because an actual materiality disclosure is a legal disclosure process. But as you're working through your internal process for this, you can say, gee, I think this looks to be material. It's going to be much harder to argue that it is not material after you've done the work to say, oh, it looks like it's going to hit this financial threshold this way. So I think that covers much of the incident disclosure piece of it. For the 10K part of it, this annual part of the disclosure, I come up with a couple of metrics that I think can help better understand what that looks like. So if you think about what these risks look like, and perhaps we'll reach a stage in public disclosure around cybersecurity where we get into much more detail than generally speaking, because we handle data, I am exposed to data theft risk, which is not really very helpful, I think, in terms of what the investor community wants. If we start talking about, I think that we have exposure to data risk, I think that looks like on average about $10 million worth of loss, over a period of 3 to 5 years. You begin sort of computing these other metrics, such as how fast are these material risk changing quarter over quarter, month over month. I think there's a 5% rise in that, a 10% decrease in that. And then I think you can also, as part of those disclosures, say we had an incident this year. It was impactful, but it was actually within what our forecasted range was for this. These are things that you do with financial disclosures all the time. But also the kind of thing that I think can give you the ability to better understand how good your firm is at managing cybersecurity generally that way. So let's talk about this for a second. So how do we kind of go about doing this? So this is an example of what's called a loss exceedance curve. Our firm puts these together for everybody. I'll show you this at the end, but we're running a special now where I'm available to help do some special sessions with you to better understand what your loss looks like and what that materiality piece looks like. But this is kind of what you get, is this view of, hey, here's a variety of different scenarios. Here's your probability of hitting these particular numbers. So what do we do around this? This gives you a couple different options once you've had the ability to do this and you've looked at this from a process perspective. The first is, how do I prioritize spending in areas that are material? And then, do I, and this is a very mature way of thinking about it, could I actually lower cybersecurity spending in some places and reallocate it somewhere else? This really sort of shows, especially to cybersecurity teams that are reporting through CFO organizations, that you're taking cybersecurity and the firm's financial performance very, very seriously that way. I think it requires the ability and precipitates the ability for you to begin looking at other cybersecurity strategies. There are a couple things that sort of cascade off of this. One is a spend thing. The second is a sort of risk transfer insurance or your capital plan. What do we do if we actually have losses that look like this? You can begin to build arguments for, because we have these things, these issues that we found that can contribute to material events, it's justified for us to spend money on doing that. You can build out lots of financial metrics and then begin to categorize these things in what in more mature ERM programs is sometimes called level 1 or level 2 kind of risk, these sort of categorical breakdown of, we have cyber risk, we have categorical risk underneath it, and then underneath that, at level 3 or 4, we're tracking particular control deficiencies that can trigger those things above it that way. There are other metrics that are important, not just the financial ones, and I'll give an example of that here in a second. But you can begin looking for things like record count or outage durations, sort of quantifying things that have sort of a qualitative nature to them. And you can begin thinking about, what's my probability of exceeding those types of stuff, and are we comfortable with what those are? So I'm a risk professional. So what I did was I didn't want to rely upon a live demo. So I put a couple slides in here, but I think what I'm going to do is load up that demo so that we can get a good deep view into what that looks like in terms of how we are putting together materiality assessments for firms today. So this is our materiality analysis feature that we put together here. Underneath all of this is these loss impact scenarios that we compute for you. And you can see they're categorized in these 6 categories. I mentioned sort of layering of risk, categorical risk this way, and this is really what it looks like. So these sort of categories of risk are very suitable for disclosure on an annual report. We think we have business interruption risk that looks like this, et cetera. But when you plug those into this materiality analysis, it gives you the ability to trial a couple different thresholds. And if you remember from the beginning, I said that materiality is somewhat equivalent to risk appetite that way. And the thing about this, as much as I spend my career working on cyber risk quantification, it is really a very qualitative emotional reaction to those numbers that helps you set thresholds. So that's what this is about here, is sort of we've pre-computed a number of different thresholds. And if you could look here, we began with this 1 basis point of revenue and go all the way up to 2% of revenue this way, giving you the opportunity to look at a couple different thresholds. And this is a fictitious company, but imagine sort of putting this on a slide with the word draft and saying, are you comfortable with which of these types of thresholds here? Here's what our average loss looks like. Here's what 45 million or $90 million looks like. And you can begin to dive deep into this. Like, maybe I'm thinking 45 million is the right threshold for my firm. And, we have, these statistics around whether or not we exceed that, what that looks like. 13% chance of having an event that could lead to this. And if we did, it could have these sort of statistics about it. Down here are some MITRE ATT&CK pieces that tell me here's what my likelihood of experiencing these types of cyber events that lead to this type of loss looks like. I also mentioned that there's not just financial metrics, but also some less financial metrics, I guess we should say. So number of records compromised. This is an interesting graph because it has this really interesting drop off here. But again, the same kind of thing. How many records are we comfortable defining as this threshold? And then how do we manage to that? And then finally, outage duration here, the same thing. Part of our modeling simulates outages, simulates records stolen in different events. So we're able to sort of map these out for you and say, what do we think this outage duration looks like? In this case, your average is far in excess of what these ones look like. So maybe you want to set a custom threshold here and begin to manage to that. But this sort of gives you the opportunity to solicit feedback from your organizations to get a better sense of, what are we okay managing to? What are we, what is acceptable? I worked for a lot of even very large organizations that had risk appetite statements that were very blasé. We don't accept any high risk, which is difficult to manage to, but it is much easier to manage to $45 million worth of annual loss, and then starting to put a security program around there with cost and staffing and operational tail to manage to that. So this is just a quick overview of how these things work. As we wrap up this assessment here, we're looking at this offer here, which I mentioned earlier, as a one-on-one session with me where we can talk more about this and look at some specific numbers for your firm and get a sense of what those thresholds should be. I just touched briefly on anything that is a part of the calculation for those types of things. But that's a deeper dive session. We're actually doing that next week with a colleague of mine. We're going to go really deep into the platform and understand where these numbers come from and how quick and easy it is to put them together. But the idea is that once you have them, you can begin to see things like what this materiality looks like. Once you have that, you can populate your disclosure forms with this. And then again, you have an incident. It looks like a data breach incident. We already know there's a 7% chance it's going to be material. That really facilitates that disclosure process for that. So that's it for us today. I appreciate joining us and taking the time to understand more about SEC disclosure rules and materiality. If you're interested in having one of those one-on-one sessions, reach out and we will be in touch with you. Thank you all for joining.